What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and a lot of you guys know I'm not really huge on rumors. However, there is one that caught my attention, which has basically established that Shuma-Gorath is going to appear in Doctor Strange 2. So, in this video, I'm going to make you guys an expert on Shuma-Gorath. Now, here's the thing. Shuma-Gorath is very powerful, but there are different iterations of Shuma-Gorath, which is to say when he sends like a copy of himself versus the actual Shuma-Gorath himself. So this goes back pretty far, well, not really far, but actually a pretty obscure comic, which was released in 2014 called Marvel Fact Files, and in issue number 46, they actually detailed the story of Shuma-Gorath, at least to a degree. What this really revealed is that Shuma-Gorath was also, or really was, a mini-angled one. Now, up to this point, we didn't really know that for certain. We largely believed it, but for those of you guys who don't know what the mini-angled ones are, and the reason why this is so important for Doctor Strange 2, in Marvel Comics, the way the multiverse works is wide and varying, right? There's a lot of moving parts. You have the Omniversal Development Court, you've got the Time Variance Authority, you've got different teams like the Exiles, you've got the Multiversal Avengers, which were written by, well, really they started in Hickman's run and then continued on in Al Ewing's Ultimate Avengers run. You've got the Custodian of the Multiverse, you've got the Multiversal Eternity, you got a lot of stuff going on there. But what you have here are different universes. And so if you imagined this giant empty space, and each universe was like a circle or like a world unto itself, then the space between those universes is what the mini-angled ones inhabit. They basically occupy that space. So I always liken it to a brick wall in the sense that the universes are bricks and the mini-angled ones are in the spaces or the mortar between the bricks. That's usually how I always kind of label that, but they're basically super powerful beings. Shuma-Gorath is largely considered to be the most powerful out of all of them. Now, in more recent years, Marvel has introduced this interesting concept called Kogoth, which is basically like this servant that was created by Shuma-Gorath, and that was covered in Wolverine First Class issue number 12, which was actually not too long ago. You can include that if you want to, it's not super important. The important thing about Shuma-Gorath is that in the early days of Earth, he, along with the rest of the Great Old Ones, which are sometimes referred to as the Elder Gods, although that's kind of a misnomer, had basically ruled the world. One of the funny things about the mini-angled ones, though, is that by and large, they actually predate the universe, and that's why there's no real definitive origin as to where the Great Old Ones or the mini-angled ones, or whatever you want to call them, where they actually come from. The Elder Gods do have a definitive origin. We've covered that before, but for the mini-angled ones, they really don't, right? Some of them kind of predate the universe. Some of them are considered to be demonic in nature, so they come from demonic dimensions. We don't really know exactly where they hail from. But what we do know is that at some point, Shuma-Gorath made his way to Earth and then basically started ruling it in a pretty horrible way, right? Literally feasting on people, absorbing their energy, different things along those lines. But around 1,000,000 years before the modern era, what you got was a guy named Sizemore. Now, Sizemore was a really cool character. He was stupidly powerful. By the end of his attempt to garner all magical energy across the universe into himself, he basically became God, but he came from the 31st century. And at that point in time, most of humanity had learned how to use magical energy, but magical energy was finite. And so there were constant conflicts and battles over who would be able to wield the most amount of energy. People trying to take the ability from other people, so on and so forth, killing people off so there would be less competition and so on. But Sizemore actually sought to go back to the source of magical energy and then absorb it there and then make himself a god. Now, one of the reasons why Sizemore is such an interesting character, specifically with regards to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is that in the MCU in Doctor Strange, you had a book called the Book of Cagliostro. You guys probably remember that when the Ancient One was talking about it. The reason why that matters is because in Marvel Comics, there was a point during his time-hopping capers and so on when Sizemore showed up in relatively the modern era and then created the identity of Cagliostro and then wrote down all his knowledge of magical energy in that book. And that's why a lot of Marvel Comics fans are exceedingly excited about the Book of Cagliostro in the MCU, because it means we could see Sizemore, because the book itself does not have an origin in the MCU. We don't know exactly where it came from. And so because of that, ultimately, one of the things that happens, and you had a couple things take place, in terms of the main form of Shuma-Gorath, this was defeated about 20,000 years before the modern day. And this actually takes place in the old Conan stories, which is interesting enough because Conan dealt with a lot of monsters, demons, different things like that. And so what you got was that in Conan the Barbarian, issue number 260 in 1992 by Roy Thomas, you got this story where following the defeat of Shuma-Gorath at the hands of Sizemore, that he basically found a way to return. And when he did, he started ruling about 20,000 years before the modern era, and did so in much the same way that he did before he'd been defeated. Ultimately, people basically sent out a call for help to the Conan god Crom, who basically created these 3 books. And when a shaman went to go confront Shuma-Gorath, Shuma-Gorath was ultimately defeated and then locked inside these things, which were called the Ironbound Books of Shuma-Gorath. And the way this worked is that these books, if they were used and essentially if they were manipulated, a person could actually free Shuma-Gorath. So for those of you guys coming from like WandaVision, it's very similar to the Darkhold in the sense that the demon god Chthon is always trying to use the Darkhold as a means to return to the main universe and conquer it. Shuma-Gorath is always trying to get individuals to use the Ironbound books to basically release him into the modern era. But this tale of Shuma-Gorath is actually expanded on in the old Conan stories, and actually a little bit of a build-up to Conan 260, which actually started in 252 and then ran through 254, 255, and then 257 into 260. And the way this played out is it basically told us that following his defeat by the shaman, with Shuma-Gorath continuing this campaign to get people to use the Iron Books, this basically led to a couple different characters. One was a guy by the name of Kulan Gath, and the second was the Hyborian demon witch queen by the name of Vamatar. Now, this essentially led to these various armies, or really these two individuals, their armies fighting to a standstill, and then what ended up happening is that the Ironbound books of Shuma-Gorath were ultimately used, and that while Vamatar had the books themselves, that Kulan Gath actually had the key to open the books. And so the way this played out is that Kramid intervened and actually sent an avalanche, which basically buried the books so that nobody could really use them. And ultimately, both of these different sorcerers kind of went their separate ways, believing that each one had been dead. Eventually, when you got into Conan the Barbarian, issue number 252, you end up learning that Conan, along with a companion by the name of Hob, had basically traveled north in order to confront the enchantress Vamatar, and then ultimately Hob was basically taken by Shuma-Gorath and forced to read the Ironbound books, which in doing so, freed Shuma-Gorath from his prison. Now, the story itself would ultimately conclude with Shuma-Gorath being re-imprisoned by Crom and essentially locked away again, and he would really remain there for quite some time until you get to the old Doctor Strange stories. Now, the idea of Shuma-Gorath appearing in the Doctor Strange stories are really a hallmark of the character, and this came in Marvel Premiere issues number 3 through 10, and this basically saw Doctor Strange and the Ancient One facing off against basically most all of their major enemies outside of Dormammu, and then ultimately Doctor Strange realizes that they're all kind of being manipulated and used, and being sent forward as more or less pawns. When he traces this back to its source, he discovers that Shuma-Gorath is basically doing this as a means to try to find a way to escape, and that Shuma-Gorath is destined to escape by using the mind of the Ancient One. And so this basically led to the original comic book version of how the Ancient One died. And so what this saw was that Doctor Strange ultimately had to kill the Ancient One in order to stop Shuma-Gorath from re-emerging. One of the things that I do want to point out here is that in the Doctor Strange mythos, this is huge. This is probably one of the most significant moments in the story, really in the history of his character, for a couple different reasons. The first is because of the fact that this was part of the hero's journey, right? So the mentor ultimately dying and the hero having to go forward of their own accord with the skills they've learned and do various things. But two, it showed the power of Shuma-Gorath, that in Doctor Strange comics at that point in time, and even in Marvel Comics as a whole, Doctor Strange was almost nigh omnipotent, right? This guy could do virtually anything he wanted to if the story required him to do it, and Marvel would just chalk it up to some use of spells. The Ancient One was more powerful than Stephen Strange was, and so the fact that Stephen Strange had to kill his mentor in order to stop Shuma-Gorath from coming through blew the minds of people at the time. I only know by virtue of having read the letters pages, but you guys should go back and read them if you ever get a chance. In the old Marvel Premiere stories, especially in number 10, it's kind of nuts. Now, in Strange Tales issues 9 through 14, this would really expand on the Shuma-Gorath mythos in a few different ways. One of the first ways this did this was by way of Stephen Strange having to face off against Shuma-Gorath directly. Now, this also invoked something called the Wings of Needless Sorrow, which are pretty cool. They're an interesting concept. You don't really see them all too often, but it's basically a source of magic used by Stephen Strange in light of using what's essentially light side magic or good magic. Now, the reality is that when it comes to magic in Marvel Comics, dark side magic is pretty interesting. Doctor Strange, for the most part, tries to shy away from it. Agatha Harkness in Marvel Comics has said on multiple occasions that black magic and white magic or light magic or whatever, they're all basically the same thing and you just use them for different ends. But at the end of the day, dark magic is one of those things where when you use it, it has a tendency to influence your soul, right? And to screw you up, to basically turn you into a dark and twisted version of yourself. Now, initially, Doctor Strange was not really big on using it, but then he came in contact with a guy by the name of Kalu, or Kaluyu. It depends on how you want to pronounce it. I always call him Kalu. He was basically at one point the friend of the Ancient One and then turned enemy. Ultimately, he's the one that essentially told Stephen Strange the only way to really defeat the old ones or the many-angled ones, especially somebody like Shuma-Gorath, is to use dark magic. And so at the time, because of previous actions, Stephen Strange was not really able to use the Eye of Agamotto, and so ultimately had to revert to using the Wings of Needless Sorrow. And all this really does, at least as far as it's been told from how it was told in this story, as well as future appearances, especially during Infinity, is that the Wings of Needless Sorrow allow the user to essentially absorb magical energy from virtually anybody around them. And that's exactly what Stephen Strange did. That he actually absorbed magical energy from all kinds of people, including one of the Chaos Lords, Ariok. And so this basically led to him traveling directly to the realm, to the home realm of Shuma-Gorath. And this is when you saw a lot of expansion, because one of the things that we learned in this story is that Shuma-Gorath had actually conquered multiple dimensions. There were different universes out there, all of which had been conquered by Shuma-Gorath, and all the people in those individual universes basically worshipped him like a god. And so in essence, the modern day version of Earth would have essentially just been another world that was conquered by Shuma-Gorath. That's really all it would have been. But ultimately, Stephen Strange is successful in defeating Shuma-Gorath, but also at the cost of himself in particular. And the reason why is because Stephen Strange was basically warned by Shuma-Gorath due to the power he possesses, and because of the fact that Stephen Strange was siphoning off the power of Shuma-Gorath as the two of them fought, that as Stephen absorbed that through the wings of needless sorrow, that he would ultimately become Shuma-Gorath. And that's basically what happened. And so ultimately, when Shuma-Gorath was kind of defeated and then confined back to a different dimension, that Stephen Strange had to go on a kind of spirit journey of sorts to basically remove the influence of Shuma-Gorath from his own body and then return back to his normal self. But following that, Shuma-Gorath had a few appearances here and there. He had some appearances involving Nicholas Scratch in the Fantastic Four stories, really with issue number 26, which was written by Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa. I'm pretty sure I'm messing that name up. But over time, Shuma-Gorath was one of these characters that largely just kind of fell into a bit of obscurity, in the sense that he was one of the early Doctor Strange villains. He had some cool stories about him, but all that really changed by the time you got into the more modern era. Now, this particularly dealt with the launch of what was called the second iteration of the Mighty Avengers. And the way this played out is that you had the main Mighty Avengers team. And for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, the Mighty Avengers were originally formed as a Carol Danvers Captain Marvel team, or really Miss Marvel as she was known at the time, which was kind of a complement to the existing Avengers roster, which was pro-superhuman registration following the events of Civil War. And so the Mighty Avengers basically served as like the long arm of the law, and they would travel around and round up superheroes who hadn't registered like they were supposed to. Now, by the time the second iteration of the Mighty Avengers came around, that was already gone. But the team had been formed by Luke Cage, and then it had a roster of like Spectrum, Monica Rambeau, you had Blue Marvel, you had a lot of different characters who were there. What ended up happening during this event was actually part of the larger Infinity story, and that's when you basically saw Thanos showing up on Earth. And so in a lot of ways, part of the plot of what you saw in Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. But the Ebony Maw had basically traveled to Stephen Strange, and despite not really having any powers into himself, actually talked Stephen Strange into using or really bringing back the wings of needless sorrow, and then in turn bringing back Shuma-Gorath. Now, the version of Shuma-Gorath that returned during Infinity was only a copy of himself. It was not actually Shuma-Gorath, but it was enough to cause a massive amount of panic. Now, ultimately, it was destroyed by Blue Marvel, which basically saw Adam Brashear just flying through the head of Shuma-Gorath and completely destroying him. Now, I would say the last significant moment of Shuma-Gorath really came by way of Doctor Strange Damnation, which is a story that we haven't necessarily covered yet, and we can if you guys are really interested, and we might once we get closer to Doctor Strange 2, because we are quite some time out before that movie releases. But basically, this saw a handful of things happening, but one of the biggest things that took place is it saw Mephisto taking up residence in Las Vegas. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Mephisto, he's basically one of the many iterations of Satan in Marvel Comics, but the closest to Satan that you have in Marvel. Satan himself, as he's traditionally depicted in Judeo-Christianity, doesn't necessarily exist. You do have like Damon Hellstrom, right, like the son of Satan, but it does get a little murky when it comes to the various Hell Lords. The closest thing we have now in Marvel Comics is the One Below All, right, kind of the antithesis to the One Above All and the source of like all evil that exists throughout the entirety of creation. Not enough has been revealed about the One Below All to truly understand the purpose that it serves. It's simply just there, and honestly, we don't really know if we will see a lot, because I think we have like 3 issues before Al Ewing basically finishes his run on the Immortal Hulk. But during the Damnation story, what you really saw here was kind of like a massive war that took place between the different Hell Lords that all existed inside the demonic dimensions. And Mephisto ultimately emerged victorious and then locked away pretty much all the various Hell Lords and their different iterations in a kind of secret realm. Shuma-Gorath was one of the people who was locked away. Ultimately, he was met by the arrival of the Ultimate Avengers and Doctor Strange, and then Dormammu intervened, and Dormammu actually ended up in a fight with Shuma-Gorath, which was pretty cool. And then essentially Shuma-Gorath was more or less kind of defeated and then confined back to his dimension again. But that's largely the role the characters played, right? The most significant moments regarding Shuma-Gorath in Marvel Comics have long since gone, right? Because Doctor Strange, even among himself, is kind of more of a background character than Marvel Comics. I mean, he kind of has a solo series, but you don't really see him doing anything near as much as he used to in like the early 90s and any period before that, right? Like, he's just largely been a background character. It's just kind of the nature of things. Some of the more recent stories have been cool, but again, Shuma-Gorath, just as an extension of being largely a Doctor Strange villain, has fallen into even more obscurity than Doctor Strange kind of had, just because of the fact that there's just other things that I guess Marvel wants to focus on. I don't really have an answer to the question of why Marvel doesn't do much with Shuma-Gorath anymore. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.